Alright. Hello, everybody. Is this on? Everybody hear me okay? Cool beans. My name is Adrian Crenshaw, and my presentation for today is something called the Dingleberry Pi, or making a Dropbox out of a Raspberry Pi. Now, a little bit about me. I run IronGeek.com. Hopefully, some of you all have been to the website before. I have an interest in InfoSec education. I don't know everything. I'm just a geek with extra time in my hands. If I get something wrong, let me know. Let's see, skip past that. I'm also a regular on the ISD podcast, or as I like to say, irregular, because I'm only on Thursdays, but they podcast anywhere between 5 and 6 times a week. So if you ever have like boring time during your commute, good thing to listen to in the car. I'm also a senior information security engineer for Diebold, where we do various things. Well, besides just in-house security, also do outsourced pen testing and managed services for people. And I'm also a co-founder of DerbyCon. All right, a little bit of what this talk's about. And this, I guess I had a bit of feature creep in this talk once I figured out all the extra things you can do with a Raspberry Pi. Originally, this talk I did on a Pogo plug, and it was about making a black throw. Essentially, little block boxes you can leave behind on someone else's network. One of the reasons I call this the Dingleberry Pi is because it's something unwanted that hangs off of someone else's network. And little boxes you can leave behind that you can either remote into or remote back out to you. Now, the idea of a Thoughtcast, and I think that's Swedish for black throw, it's also as a kamikaze box and so forth, is to add a level of anonymity to that, something to obfuscate who's communicating with it by using Tor or I2P. I'm using I2P just because I really dig I2P. However, I2P is Java-based, which causes some problems, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Black throws are more of a term for people interested in anonymity. Dropbox is more a term for people interested in pen testing. If you all heard the Pogo plug, Pwn plug, Pony Express, stuff like that, very similar concept, except that's meant more for pen testing purposes. Also, I'm going to show a bunch of other cool stuff you can do with the Raspberry Pi. Now, how I got into this whole subject, way back when I worked at a university, and I got a bunch of these JetDirect boxes. I was like, these things have full IP stacks. What can I do with these? What can I do to drop these on another network and have them do something for me? And at the time, there wasn't a whole lot of really small embedded boxes. So I had this idea in the back of my head for a while. And then finally, all these little boxes started coming out that made doing something like what I want to do easy, something that you could leave on someone else's network and have remote back out to you. So there's all sorts of things you can use for this, for leaving something else on someone else's network and have it come back to you. One is an old laptop or PDA. Now, I guess old laptops are hard to come by for some people, but I'm pretty sure this audience, there's a fair number of you all that have old, Pentium 2 or better laptops that you have nothing better to do with it, and are sitting there collecting dust. Zip-it was kind of an interesting idea. Zip-it is this little micro thing that's meant for chatting, but it's very low end, like 32 megs of memory. It's got an ARM processor, but wasn't very powerful. But for $50, had a little screen, had a keyboard. It was nifty. Had Wi-Fi built in. There's many ITX boards you can use, though that's probably getting a little pricey again. There's things like the Beagle board, which I guess is the closest thing I can think of to something similar to what the Raspberry Pi we're talking about is, but much more expensive. Plug computers, like the last time I did a talk similar to this, I was using that pink Pogo plug as my base. I think the other white one there is a Shiva plug. Very small computers you can leave behind a network. Depending on how you hide them, they might look like wall warts, so no one might even suspect them. I need to do some work on making one that's power over Ethernet for the Raspberry Pi, and then you can get really stealthy with it, which in theory, what do you get? Is it 40-something volts out of power over Ethernet? 40 what, 48? Thank you. So you get a voltage regulator, drop that down to 5, do a little extra work. Shouldn't be much of a problem. I just haven't actually done it yet. WRT54G is also a popular idea for Dropbox, and that's Larry Pesci modeling the 54G. And those are also good. Pretty much anything that has Linux embedded on it, a lot of stuff I'll show you here will work. Like I'll be showing how to make a Dropbox that basically sends a shell back to you via SSH and shovels a shell past like NAT and firewalls that aren't particularly good on egress filtering. And a lot of this will apply there too. Oh, the MK802, I have one of these things on order. The little itty bitty Android, almost looks like a thumb drive, but a little bit fatter, that you can hook up to your TV, have Wi-Fi built in, as I understand it. You can plug in like an Ethernet via USB, and these are probably a little bit more powerful than the Pogo plug, than the Raspberry Pi I'll be showing off. but I don't have mine yet. They're meant for plugging into your TV as media centers, but at like, $70 or so, I wouldn't mind leaving behind on someone's network. Also, they can run, full operating systems, something a little bit more desktop-ish than Android. For instance, you can get Ubuntu on these. And finally, the Raspberry Pi, which is what I'm going to be concentrating on in this talk. Now, here's the Raspberry Pi in a nutshell, and if I want to actually show you what the size of the thing is. A picture does not necessarily show you that kind of information. Let me move some of my gear closer to me. All right, the Raspberry Pi, and assuming I don't unplug my video in the process of doing this, is essentially this. Doesn't come with the SD card. You pay $35, you get this. This doesn't have Wi-Fi on it either, though it does have Ethernet. Has 2 USB ports, has RC out for composite video, has, I think that's a 3.5 millimeter audio jack, has HDMI out, that's pretty nifty, and general purpose I/O. You boot from an SD card, which you have to purchase separately. I buy a lot of stuff from Merit Line, and SD cards are dirt cheap. As far as power, it's a little, well, that's the particular model of ARM. It's a little 700 megahertz ARM 6. Boots from SD card, has 256 megs of memory, and the thing is, it has, I think the original developers of this was Broadcom, and the guy who decided up on this project was working at Broadcom. I think they maybe were intending for like media related devices, because it has a decent video processor on it. So I've seen these things run quake-free at a decent frame rate before. So if you can know how to tie into that, I imagine you can make these things even more powerful than they currently are. I think a lot of limitations on the Raspberry Pi right now is the software stack, because these things have, my understanding they have hardware floating point, but a lot of the software out there for them only uses software floating point, so it's not as fast as it could ideally be. But I'm gonna give it some time. Also, the stack, as far as USB is concerned, I've had weird issues where if I plug in a keyboard and well, actually it's not quite a keyboard, it's this thing, which I'll talk about in a second, and wireless at the same time, they'll drop out. And somehow those quirks right now. But in time, it should be a really cool platform. The downside to the Raspberry Pi right now, they're massively oversold. I mean, people can't get them. They're on waiting lists to order them. And at $35 for what you get, I can understand that. You go on eBay to try to buy one, people are charging like $100 or better. And like, at that point, I think I'd go ahead and look at a Beagle board. Or, even an Atom-based x86 kind of system. But, they're all nifty. And once they start getting them more produced and more people have gotten past the whole run on them, that'll be an awesome thing for Dropboxes. Now, to give you an idea about how I want to drop this on a network, you have your general straight connect where you just plug it in and you either remote into it or maybe have it shovel a shell out to you. But let's say you want to get a little more sneaky. In this connection, you'd know my IP address. If you were looking at your firewall logs, you would see where I'm coming from. Let's get a little more tricky. Let's use a darknet. We can use something like Tor or I2P, route things through that, and so the IP address that's actually communicating with the Raspberry Pi is not me. It's someone else. It's someone I'm proxying through. In the case of I2P, since it's kind of a mesh network in a way, as far as how stuff gets routed through different people, and by default, as soon as you join, you're part of that mesh and you're routing traffic for other people, it gets really confusing. Though, when I say you're routing traffic for other people, I2P is focused on hidden services, basically hiding things inside the network, not for out-proxying to the public internet. Just because you install I2P does not mean that you become a public proxy of the internet. What it does mean, though, by default, is traffic will be routed through you to other people on the I2P network. There are a few people, though, who do host out proxies, so you could get out on the public internet with it. Now, a darknet, I keep referring to a darknet. There's a few different definitions. Like, this is a definition that's entirely different from the one I'm using for unused IP space, and if anybody hits that, you know they must be up to no good because no one should be hitting it. In this case, I mean a darknet as a network that you don't have a whole lot of visibility into it. Essentially, anonymizing networks. They generally use encryption and proxies, and what you'll do is you'll create a message. You'll encrypt it, maybe like, say, 3 levels in the case of Tor by default, and you'll say, okay, I'm going to encrypt this, and I'm going to encrypt it with that person's key, that next person's key, and that person's key. Then I'm going to encrypt it layer on layer. That's why Tor is called Tor, the onion router, because onions are like ogres. And you pass it along. And each person has their own key, so they can unencrypt it and send it on to the next person, but they can't still see the contents because they don't have all the keys. The very last person can unencrypt it, and he can see the plain text, unless because it's an encrypted protocol, and pass it on. However, since he got it through 2 other people, in theory, he doesn't know who actually sent it. He may know what the contents are, but there's still anonymity because he doesn't know I sent it. he would think the person just before him, well, he actually, since he's using Tor, he knows what it is. But only information he has is who the previous hop was. I2P works on similar principles. These things are also referred to as cipher spaces. I just love that term. And I2P is my cipher space of choice. Truth be told, on the Raspberry Pi, I probably should be looking more into Tor, since Tor is written in, I believe is it C or straight C? Is it straight C or C++? Regardless, you can compile it and go a whole lot faster probably than I2P. I2P is Java, and there's some tweaks to get Java to work right on the Raspberry Pi. As far as encryption is concerned, oh man, there's all sorts of encryption protections inside of I2P. I mean, you have your end-to-end tunnel protection for the entire tunnel, because I2P is oddball in the sense that you have in tunnels and out tunnels. So how the message gets to you and how you send one back out could be entirely different people. This makes traffic analysis attacks, which is, I think, a major interest of various people in the intelligence community, much harder to do. And not only that, you have levels of encryption between each hop, and then between the in tunnel and the out tunnel, through the entire tunnel. It's just layer upon layer, and quite frankly, I don't think I have the math background to explain to you all the encryption involved, but it's all out there, and as far as I can tell for what review I've done of it, they're using other people's, one of the general tenets of encryption is don't write your own encryption libraries. They're following that through and through, and they're using stuff, my understanding, that other people, Java developers have come up with. But let's talk about getting Linux on the Raspberry Pi. This is uber simple. Now I'm using Wheezy, so it's not quite ready for prime time, but I thought it would be easier, and I'm used to Debian and Ubuntu, where I can apt-get everything. But there's also Arch Linux, there's Raspbian. Raspbian's neat. Remember how I mentioned these things have hardware floating point, but a lot of software is not compiled for it? Well, the normal Debian distributions aren't compiled to use it. Raspbian is. The problem is I've been getting problems with getting Raspbian to work with some of the other things I want to do, so I'm using more of the plain Jane flavors. And Raspbian even says that they're not quite ready for prime time, but they're working on making a complete Debian distribution for the Raspberry Pi that does have hardware floating point enabled. If you want to know how to install this, just check out this particular wiki. It's really not hard. You can either use DD, which comes with most Unix-like operating systems. I use Windows, since I'm lame like that, and Windows 32 Disk Imager. You basically point to the image, write to it, writes down the SD card, and you're good to go. Now, a lot of these images, I'm using the beta, by the way, for most of the stuff I'm doing. The Wheezy beta says I figure if something breaks there, I can figure out how to fix it, and that way in future versions, my documentation is hopefully still good for a little bit longer. And Gparted is something I use to resize it. A lot of the images you'll download are like for 2 or 4 gigabyte SD cards, and a lot of times I'm using 16 gigabyte SD cards because I'm like, I can get one for like $10 now, why not? You can use Gparted on a Linux distribution, pop the SD card in, and resize it. And I mean, these tools are super simple. This is on a Windows box, me using Win32 Disk Imager. I just point at the image and point to the disk I want and say write. It's as simple as that. As far as resizing it gets a little bit complicated. That's actually Gparted running on a backtrack box. You can just apt-get Gparted, resize that bad boy, move the swap to the end, and you're golden. Now, another notable mention as far as OSs you can put on these is PwnPy. And I'm not going to go through that entire list. And I have made some comments about some of them. Basically, I think what they did was there was a few things by hand, like Metasploit. I think they by hand installed in the distribution. But there's Metasploit on there. And I have instructions on my website on installing Metasploit. These guys also installed but pretty much everything security related at all that they could find in the Debian repositories. They apt-get and got into it as far as I could tell. Some of the stuff doesn't quite make sense though, like BK Hive. All right, I'm not going to copy a SAM and system file off of someone else's machine, then take it to my Raspberry Pi, then extract the hashes. And some of the cracking tools on here as far as password cracking, if the Raspberry Pi is the fastest thing you have, you need to look into something else. But it's neat that they have it there. Also some of the forensics tools I'm not sure about. But if you want a pre-made, a whole bunch of security tools, the closest thing you're probably going to see to backtrack on the Raspberry Pi, this is the thing to go with. By the way, I know some of you are thinking, wait a second, isn't there a backtrack ARM distribution? There is. It doesn't seem to be actively developed. It's still at the 5.0 version, and it's not made for this particular type of ARM. I've tried to run it in a change root environment. I haven't had luck. I could be wrong. Maybe someone else can figure out how to do it. But so far, I don't think the version that they have out there will work on this particular ARM platform. All right, setting up I2P. I'm going to gloss over this because, quite frankly, It is incredibly boring, and it's something more prone to you looking at my website later on and going through the sheet. But just to give you all the work it takes to actually get I2P on it, on a Windows box, or a Linux box for that matter, it's not too hard if it's a full-blown x86 box. It gets a little more difficult here. Of course, always update everything on the Pi first, just so you have everything, especially since I'm using Wheezy, and I think a lot of things weren't quite ready for prime time. And, oh, yeah, we fixed that. Go ahead and do a new apt-get. Well, now it's fixed, and you can continue on. I have to install Java. Now, at one time, if you really want to get things faster, you may want to try downloading Oracle's version of embedded Java. Might be a little faster. I did get mine to work with the default Java, which is the OpenGGK, OpenJRE. But just grab the default JRE headless. I also grabbed XRDP just so I can remote into it. Because, yeah, you have a full-blown GUI on here. You can remote in using RDP or VNC and control it. I make a directory called IPBin to put all my stuff in and change directory into it. That first one, by the way, just changed directory into my current home. I'm running this as the locally pre-made Pi account. Change the password, of course. In previous versions of this project, I ran as root, which is a really bad idea. But in this, you're running as Pi, so even if they compromise I2P in theory, they have to do some other local level exploits to be able to get further. You can wget the jar file to install I2P, and then you simply run it. By the way, this Koaka, if somebody else knows the better way of pronouncing that, let me know. Is it Koka? Kaka? How you say it? Cow? Cacao? Cacao. I feel silly saying that, but it's no sillier than the other things I said. Cacao. I'm using it here, and I probably don't need to. Cacao tells it to use a particular version of Java that uses just-in-time compiling. So it's a lot faster. And when you start doing a whole bunch of encryption, like I showed you in the previous slide that ITP does, that becomes important. All right, so I unpack it, I put it all where it needs to go, but there's one problem. The current version, or at least the current version last time I checked, they may release something new in a couple of days. ZZZ, the head developer of ITP, and his guys are always putting out new versions. It didn't quite recognize the right version of the big int library from Java I needed to use. It was trying to give me ARM5, it was trying to give me ARM7, but I needed the ARM5 version. So basically, I had to unpack the jar myself and copy it into the right directory. By the way, these notes, I'm going to put these slides up. These instructions are already up on my website. So that's one of the things I said I'm going to gloss over them because it's really boring to see me talk about, see me explain every single command in here. But I changed directory into I2P bin, and I'm going to edit runplain.sh. There actually is a service you can install, but I'm not quite sure how to modify that yet to make it work on ARM properly. In previous versions, it didn't work right. It looks like it'll probably work right on the Pi. I haven't tweaked it enough. Runplain is just something a shell script you can run and it'll start up I2P for you. And I edit one of the options to make sure it's using Cacao so that it's using the just-in-time compiler for speed reasons. After that, I can run plain for the first time, and I have I2P up and running. However, I'm a little quicker to kill it. The reason I run it is I want certain, profile options so I can set them in a second. Now I'm going to do some more edits. One of the first edits I do is I open up a line that looks like this. And the reason I do that is I want to be able to remote to it from any machine on my network. So I set it to this, 0000, which means everybody. That way I can remote into it. If you're going to do that, you probably want to go ahead and set a password. There actually is a line in client's config you can edit and set to some password. Not literally, some other password and some password. But not some other password, some password, even though that's a passphrase. But you don't use passphrase as a word with passphrase. Make up something. You get the point. All right. Then you can log in with admin and that. You may want to do this on your local network if you don't trust the other people on your local network. A lot of times I don't do it because I'm the only person in my house, and if you're in my house and on my Wi-Fi, I have bigger issues. I also edit the tunnel config, and I open up the proxies for HTTP and HTTPS to anybody on my LAN so that I can get out and remote. So I kind of use these as gateways. So none of my own machines are running ITP, but I can use this as a gateway to I2P. By the way, there's very similar commands. If you want to make a gateway to Tor so you don't run Tor on your local machine, you can do something very similar to that. Though there's reasons not to, involving exploiting things in the browser to figure out who someone is. There's a reason why Tor is getting away from the whole, here's Tor, just install it and use your own browser, and move more towards the browser bundle, because there's all sorts of things you can do with plugins and JavaScript and so forth to break someone's anonymity by making them make a request outside the darknet to who you actually are. So, but that's a bit of a digression. I have a tendency to do that sometimes. All right, and it's warm up here. All right, now I'm going to start I2P up again, and I can use it. However, I want it to automatically start all the time, every time I reboot the machine. An easier way to do that is to use cron tab, -E, edit your cron tab. Essentially that top line, every hour, it's going to try to run I2P. If I2P is already running, it'll go ahead and quit. So that's okay. And also, every time I reboot, it should automatically come up on startup. Now, there's some tweaks you might want to do. This thing's awfully slow. Things might get faster as the libraries get better. But you can turn off participate in tunnels. I2P, by default, you participate in other people's tunnels to route traffic. And there's good reasons to do this, even for your own anonymity, besides just being nice to the rest of the network. If I'm routing other people's traffic for me, people who are watching me don't know what traffic I'm sending necessarily that's mine or someone else's. So, what? Oh, I thought someone had said something. And of course, I can go in there and add a bunch of things to my subscriptions. They have a weird DNS system, and they do this because, well, whoever controls DNS on a regular network, they pretty much control the network in a way. If they can control who you can talk to, they can do all sorts of weird spoofing attacks. So there was a debate about how to make it convenient, yet still make it usable. Because typing in the weird keys that you have to use to get I2P to work, and I'll show you those keys in a second, wouldn't be very practical. So you can get these subscription service, and you're automatically down what basically amounts to a host file from old school internet back in the day before DNS, where you had, oh, this is the IP address, this is the name, you know. And it will map things for you. But there's a bunch of ones you can subscribe to, so you'll get a list of I2P services out there. Oh, as far as setting up a darknet so you can tunnel into this, essentially you go in to the tunnel configs, you create a server tunnel, you set it to point to localhost 22. SSH is running by default on most of the Raspberry Pi distributions I've seen. And you start that bad boy up. And you see this key? It's going to be awfully small. That's a base32 address. That's not the kind of thing you normally would want to type in. That's one of the reasons I use .I2P account, .I2P SUSE names, because they're a lot easier to remember. Like IronGeeks.I2P is mine, no apostrophe. On the other end, I've had to go in and copy this key. Now that base32 address is the easy way to actually use the key. That very small print you see up there is the key, which is like a base64 encoded binary blob. You use that, and we're going to need that to set up the tunnel on the other end. On the other end, I set up a new client tunnel, and I set it up to where whenever I SSH into my local host at port 2222 and point it to send all that traffic to this particular key, yeah, that doesn't really render well in a web page. And then I can SSH into my local host, and it automatically gets routed through I2P for all these different proxies, and the machine that's actually connecting to that Raspberry Pi on someone else's network is not mine. And it's really hard to follow who it actually is. But I can SSH in and do my thing. That was a whole lot of detail, and I have whole other talks on using darknets and I2P and hiding yourself on the internet. But now we'll go with something a little bit more plain Jane, because quite frankly, for pen test purposes, that is really slow, and if you're doing it legitimately, why do you need to hide it, really? That sounds like a bad argument, actually. Let me think that one through again. The EFF guy was going to get on me in a second. SSH phone home. Now this is a little bit easier, and this one's also great for busting through firewalls, depending on how good most people's ingress filtering is better than others, better than the egress filtering. Ingress going in, egress coming back out. So let's say if someone's behind a NAT box, like let's say a coffee shop or your home network. I'm not going to be able to remote into your machine because there was no outgoing request for me. But if there's an outgoing request, generally that's going to get right through. So what you do is you set up a Raspberry Pi to do the request for you and shovel a shell, as it's known, back out to your machine. Since it's establishing the request, the NAT box goes, hey, okay, I'll let you through, and you're golden. Now, there's a couple ways you can do this. The classic way is to use netcat. And essentially that first command says listen on port 74 for anything coming in, and on the zipit, oh, I did not change that, because these notes, originally I was doing something similar on the zipit, and I forgot to change that. I'll edit that before I give the presentation down at OISF tomorrow. But essentially on the any Linux distribution, this doesn't have to be Raspberry Pi, it doesn't have to be Zip-It, it could be a Pogo plug, it doesn't matter. You can netcat back out and tell it to use SSH, execute it, and throw all its output to this connection. And essentially what that does is it throws the shell to me. I'm not telnetting into a machine, it's telnetting back out to me and saying, hey, here's a shell for you. Very much like, I'm sure, how many people have used Metasploit? This is pretty much exactly what TCP reverse shelled is. However, there's more advanced ways of going about this. We can also set things up, let me see, to do it all via SSH. So on the Raspberry Pi, I could set something up like this where when a connection comes in, I can essentially have it set up to where it remotes back out of SSH shell for me. That way it's encrypted. Also, I can use keys, so if someone tries to modify the traffic, I'll know about it. So that's what I'm doing here. On localhost, I forward everything to localhost 22, and I'm going out on 1974. And on my home PC, I'm setting up this, SSH, and using dynamic port forwarding. That way I can also, by default with OpenSSH, you basically have a SOCKS proxy. So if you want to tunnel other traffic back into that Raspberry Pi, you can use this command, set up your, let's say, web browser to use port 1080 as your proxy port, and get back out, which is nice. So not only do you have a shell in that remote network, you now also have a host that's routing your traffic for you for anything that uses SOCKS. And that's all fine and good, but I probably want to set it up so I can do this automatically every 5 minutes. So that, I don't want it, how about this way, if I have it run once and then my shell dies, that's no good, because all sorts of network traffic could cause that to happen. So I want to keep retrying every 5 minutes if there's not an established connection, so that I always have an active connection into that network. Now, I'm going to base these following slides on Brandon's notes. What you can do is you can generate a key with that command, and the idea is to generate that key and then pass it on to your home PC so that it has it. And that way you can do basically more or less authentication to this, well, as far as actually setting up the tunnel, authenticationless SSH. However, when you actually connect from your home machine, you will have to put in a password from the Raspberry Pi. And that second command down there at the bottom, essentially all that is to take the keys I generated and throw it to my home PC. Now, as far as making a script, you can make a script called, let's say call it auto SSH, and we'll set it with rights to execute just for the owner. That's the script. And no, I'm not expecting you to remember all that from here. These notes will be up on my website before long, and so will these slides. But there's only a few things you need to set. For instance, remote host, who you want the Raspberry Pi to throw the shell to, the username, and also the password. In this case, the shell is being thrown back out as root, though I might be logging in on my machine as Pi. Then every 5 minutes, I want it to automatically try to connect out to me. And the reason I'm using that script is so that it doesn't try to make multiple connections. So right there is the cron tab command I would use, and add that line in, and you should be golden. Every 5 minutes. It should try to reattach to you. And it should blow through most NAT implementations. Now, there's all sorts of things they can still do to, block it. But I suppose you can look at some of Dave Kennedy's work on try this port, try this port, try this port, try this port, and modify it some more to make it a little bit more reliable in that sense. But it should blow through most coffee shops and home networks NATs. And then, on the PC side, I just have to use SSH, connect into dynamic port forwarding, use 1080 for my dynamic port. The port I want to actually connect on is 1974. And I'm using Pi at localhost as my account. I'm not really SSHing to my local host. What I've done is I've set up a tunnel, SSH tunnel, to come back to my machine, and it's listing on my machine on 22, and then on 1974, and then whenever I use it, it's sending all the traffic to the Pi. And also I can use the SOCKS proxy again. I know that was a whole lot of detail. All right, some other projects I've been messing around with the Raspberry Pi, Etherlogger. I was thinking, well, this is the little itty bitty ARM box. What else can I do with this thing? Well, I thought, I have a thing for hardware keyloggers. What if I could make this thing log Ethernet packets for me? I mean, I have bridge utilities. I could turn this into a 2-port switch, just a bridge, and all the packets that go through it, log it. So take it, hide it behind someone's desk, plug the Ethernet into one jack, plug my own from the Ethernet from the wall into the other jack, and go for it. Now, this thing only has one Ethernet, so I had to use a USB Ethernet adapter. Now, yeah, that drops your throughput down, but depending on the kind of connection it is, it probably won't matter. And I've used a couple scripts to essentially, this becomes a bridge, and all the traffic that comes through it, it logs. And I can come collect it later, or I can remote into this and grab the logs. So simply, I go ahead and get bridge utilities. I run TCP dump just to play around with it, but ifconfig to find some information, change directory into the root, and I created a little script called start bridge and log. Now that particular script has a few things in it. Well, the first thing is I set the IP address I want, and a few other network parameters that you're going to look up for your particular network, and I set up a bridge. Now the most important command from our perspective here is down here at the bottom. Essentially what I'm telling it to do is collect, this isn't technically 1 megabyte, it's technically, I believe, 1 million bytes, but it's not really one base 2, base 10 conversion issues. But let's go ahead and call it 3 gigs for the heck of it. So essentially, this should be a little bit under a gig because of the whole base 10, base 2 thing. And what I'm doing is I'm creating 3 files. They'll be called like mycap, I think 0, 1, and 2. And every time one fills up with 1 billion bytes, it goes ahead and creates the next one. Then when that one fills up with 1 billion bytes, it goes and fills up the next one. And then so on and so forth, then it loops back to the beginning for a series of 3. I can make that a lot bigger. Like if I had a 32 gig card in here, wait a second, I can make that a lot larger and log a lot of traffic into these files. And then either come back and collect them later or grab the SD card, bring it with me, plug it in, and copy it off. So at that point, all I have to do is start it up. But I can also edit my RC local and have it automatically start up. Oh, by the way, if you wanted to get these files remotely, you probably have to set permissions or somehow SSH in its root. That bottom line is just for change modding, so when the Pi logs in, it will have permissions to actually grab those PCAP files off. If you're planning on coming back later on, picking up the SD card and copying files off, that's good enough. Another project, and this one idea was not original to me. I did not know about this until I saw an article on Liliputing. This guy found this Atrix dock. I think these things were $300 or $400 when they came out. The idea was you'd dock your Atrix phone in that, and you'd have a full-fledged laptop to use. But, well, I guess they didn't sell a lot or whatever. You can now find these things for like, I've seen them as low as $60 online. And the nice thing about them is they have micro USB there and a micro HDMI. Well, the Raspberry Pi is powered over USB, and it has a full HDMI in. So I made this little converter cable, which I'll talk about here in a second. More information's out there. You can order these from Amazon for like $65. I think someone else has them for $60. And I ordered this itty bitty part from SparkFun to make this work. Though you can cannibalize cables, just depending on how good your soldering skills are on soldering to a micro connector and making everything function again. And I'm trying to do this without support. Let me sit this down for a second. That's a lot easier. Alright. Now, it's theory, if I have juice to this thing still. Yeah, the juice died on this one. I don't think I actually kept it plugged in. So let's see what happens. I don't know if... I remember charging it at work yesterday. Since you have to run one cable to the power, and then one cable over here, and you essentially have a little laptop with the Raspberry Pi, which is pretty nifty. Now, I call this a fallopian cable. You can guess why. But essentially, you have to take one end for the power and one end over here for your keyboard and mouse to work. Now, you have to do that. When you do that, you have to cut the 5-volt on here to make it actually function. So that gets where it gets a little tricky. And you can cannibalize cables, But I found getting one of these little, I think it was a $2 jobby from SparkFun made it a lot easier. I filed off one end so I could solder to it, and I took a micro to a full HDMI adapter, stripped off its covering, and put it down. Then by the way, I took it all back out, then soldered this. And you'll notice there that 5 volts that's going out to my keyboard input, or going into my USB input, not my power input. By the way, these things have micro USB in for power. That's not an actual USB connection though. The data lines aren't hooked up. You notice that 5 volts that I'm taking out for my keyboard signal is not connected to anything. Also, my data minus and data plus going to my power are also disconnected because, well, I don't need them. And I have that all set up. Next thing I do is I hot glue it. Hey, I gotta get it all held together somehow. Leave that there, let that settle up for a bit. That's really ugly, and I want it to be a little bit more sturdy. So, I put a shape lock. Back when I was a kid, I used to get this stuff called friendly plastic. It's the same chemicals, I'm understanding. And I used to make dentures out of it, like vampire fangs or werewolf teeth, or hillbilly teeth, whatever. And you can take it, mix it with some like clothing dye, and microwave it, and essentially you can down for plastic, you can form around whatever you want, and I did that. Though don't leave that in a black car in Vegas because it most likely will melt. And that's my fallopian cable, which I constructed here. All right, a little bit more hardware hacking. Let's say you want to do general I/O. There's some more fun things you can do with this. Like, I've done a lot of work with the Tinsy before. Well, I want to tie this thing into the Tinsy. Now, one of the issues with, we have a lot of input-output options. You have serial out on there. You have all sorts of common type of interfaces. You interface with other microelectronics, general I/O, tons of stuff. But in general, it's going to be working at 3.3 volts. That can be a bit of an issue, but we'll get on that later on. The simplest circuit we can build is just Blinky. This is how easy that is. Essentially, I tie one lead to ground, with the correct lead, the cathode, as I recall, connect the other end to one of the general I/O ports, and then the commands are as simple as this. I become root so I can control the hardware. I tell it I want to set a certain port as to be output. And then, at that point, after I set that for output, I can send out a signal to it of either 1 to turn it on or 0 to turn it back off. And actually looking at this, I have those commands in there more than I need them. I need to trim that up some. But all right, essentially if we remove a couple commands from there, I tell GPIO4 to be output, and I can set a value on it and basically turn it on and off at will. Demo time. And that more or less looks like this. Assuming I can, actually, no, second thought, I'm gonna go back to here, go there, and Blinky. All Blinky's doing is just turning it on and off. You notice that previous command I had a delay in there and it just looped around, repeating the command over and over again to turn the light on and off, on and off. Not particularly interesting, but it is the hello world of electronics projects. But that's a start. Let's get a little bit more complex. Let's say I want to hook it up to a Tinsy. Now, normally I'm hooking my Tinsy off a USB port for power, so I'm working at 5 volts, but the Raspberry Pi's general I/O ports are going to be working at 3.3. There's these little $2 jobbies you can get from probably other places you search around, find them cheaper than SparkFun. But you get 4 outputs and 4 inputs, and you can change the level of the voltage you're working with. You can also think of it as using it for 2 serial if you want to. And I've essentially rigged that up to where I can hook it into a Tinsy. And it's wired like this. That's a little boring, but essentially all I'm doing is I'm taking the outs from the Pi, running them into that logic converter, and it's stepping everything up to 5 volts or back down to 3.3 volts so I can use it. And actually, it has a wider voltage range. You tell it what voltage to use through some of these pins in the middle. But at that point, I can now make it talk to the Tinsy. And I'm basically sending through its first input a signal, either high or low, and whether that's high or low, I do something. And the commands for this are fairly simple. I'm using those same commands down here at the bottom on my Raspberry Pi to tell it to turn it on and off. But on my Tinsy, I have these commands, which essentially, whenever it goes high, it turns on that little LED. So let's go ahead and bring that up. Oh, I also have a little wireless dongle in there.
This is not the simplest way I can configure this. Got my Raspberry Pi hooked up via Wi-Fi.
Can you hear that okay?
And I'm trying to interface it with Tinsy. Now, by default, I'm working with 3.3 volts here. Oh, and then, of course, this one line is not connected on my
yeah, I'm
Raspberry
doing this off
Pi.
my camera phone.
I want to
It's
convert it to
really
5
shaky.
volts because I'm feeding my Tinsy in from a laptop. So, you see I have my general I/O port 4 hooked up. You want to look at the pinouts available on the web for what's what. I have my 3 volts going over to this little logic level converter I got from SparkFun. And I also have ground. Ground is common amongst everything. It's also common on
Well,
the
I'll
Tinsy.
explain the circuit. Let me fast forward just a
And
little
then-
bit.
Also, let's go ahead and do
Here's the
that.
code.
Now over here, I have a few things set up. Now the previous commands to this, hopefully they're in my history.
Since whenever I sing the signal, I can make the Tinsy signal.
Yeah, I had to go
want.
ahead and echo 4 into export. Also, I had to tell it what direction out. But now at this point, I should be able to toggle that on and off. This would be toggling it off, so ground essentially. And if I want to make it throw out 3.3 volts, which would then get converted back to 5 by my logic level converter, once I hit enter, it should start printing. Now that is just an incredibly simple ghetto example of interfacing an Arduino-like device, in this case a Tinsy, with a Raspberry Pi.
Now we can do it a little bit more complex. Let's say we want to send more information. Like let's say we want to send text. Here's the serial killer. Essentially, I can hook it up as a serial interface as well, using that same logic converter, and make it function as well. Here's a real simple bit of Arduino-based code I'm running on the Tinsy. I think I based it on an example that Paul came up with. Paul from the company that actually makes the Tinsys. And those are fairly simple. This thing's fairly simple to construct as well. And using the UART interface, and I can start sending text.
This time we're going to do serial, because I got my power in. And right here I'm taking 3 volts over to the low side of the logic level converter. And this time I'm doing serial. So I have TX and RX. So along I go, and
But I have all these
essentially I
schematics on my website
plug that
already.
into the Tinsy's TX and RX, but in reverse. Basically, the RX from one goes into TX of the other, and vice versa. Then of course I have it going off to my machine right here. Well, I have a few different commands I could run on this. Let me first show you some code. Somewhere on here I should have.
Yeah, this is the same code
This
as
is something
before. I'll cut to the chase. Essentially, what I'm trying to do
that's
in
on
a
his
very
website.
meandering way with the
Essentially, what
camera
we're going to
phone
do is we're going to
is
read
get to the
anything
point
that comes in
where I can
for the
cat
serial
out
interface
things
and
from one to the other,
UART
or use echo.
interface, and send it out as keystrokes.
So anything that comes in that serial port, I want it to go out the other. So right here, I want to echo hi there.
First thing we're
Out
going
to
to do
the
is we're
serial
going to echo
port.
out this particular serial device with
into my Raspberry
SSH
Pi.
into
That's
our
hooked to my
Raspberry
Tinsy.
Pi,
I go ahead
and
and
we
echo
should
out
be able to
a string,
hit enter,
and whenever I
and
echo that string out,
that
it goes through
automatically
the
gets
serial
sent as
port back out to my
keystrokes.
Tinsy.
We could also
and
do
gets
some
printed.
other things.
And this
Like
is
for
all
instance,
very
cat
simple,
out a
but it just
file.
shows it's very simple to manipulate general I/O on these
There's my password file.
Raspberry Pi devices.
So serial I/O seems fairly simple.
Oh,
I
just
need to
a
play
second ago, I
around with
also
doing
just,
it both directions.
Catted
But
out my
this is
password
fairly
files. Another
promising,
example
and
of sending text
seeing how
across that
easy this
connection.
is to interface an Arduino-based device, in this case the Tinsy, using just like a $2.
Now, in theory, with more time, you can hook sensors up to that. You can turn things on and off remotely. There's people who've made web interfaces for turning lights on and off. But for home automation, there's lots of you can probably do. Those are just very simplistic examples. More ideas of things I'd want to do with this Pi, but I haven't had time to really develop yet. Bluetooth device logger for people who leave their phones in discovery mode at all times, being able to log when they come and when they go by leaving this someplace and just have it sit there and collect data for me. Power over Ethernet's an interesting one. As I mentioned before, shouldn't take a whole lot of electronics to do that. Backtrack change root environment for ARM. Still haven't gotten that functioning yet. I may need to work on that a little bit more, though I don't think it's going to be the right architecture for it to function. Oh, a car computer for constant war drive. I thought about, this thing's so low voltage, hook up a wireless adapter to it, hook up a GPS to it, have it every time I turn my car on, automatically start war driving for me, automatically start using Kismet. Then every time I get within range of my home base, my home network, it automatically uploads the Wiggle. I thought that'd be a cool project. And mesh networks. I'm big into anonymity, and I'm curious about how you can do this, but securely, even when people block the entire internet. Like, how is an IP not good for you if there's no access to the public internet? That's where mesh networks comes in, and there's some research going on in the government for this and various other places. Essentially, there's no clear forerunner I've seen for this, but there's a few different people that have been talking about it and a few different project proposals and ideas and things they're working on. This one's actually where the U.S. government's financing some research into this and plan on dropping it off with various political dissidents so they can communicate out. These mesh networks either work from the standpoint of if all these different machines communicating with each other and one will forward a message on for another one, so that even someone takes out the infrastructure at the low level, they're building their own infrastructure. Also, you can have like store and forward networks where someone's phone sits there and listens for a message from someone else. It stores it and then forwards it on when it gets close enough to the network. There's actually an example of this in a book by Cory Doctorow called Little Brother. I have mixed feelings on the book itself, but they give an example of people building something like this with a game system, which I thought was nifty. All right, let's see. Raspberry Pi links. If you want more information on the Raspberry Pi, check out the main Raspberry Pi website. elinux.org has a lot of information on finding various problems with hardware and so forth. Like, I've been having problems with the hardware getting multiple USB devices to run at the same time. And they have a lot of primers out there. They also have information on what wireless cards work and which ones don't. And I have my own Raspberry Pi recipes out there. A few other links. If you want more information on anonymity and setting up Black Throws, it's out there. And whole lot of information on .NETs in general. Like I said, I can give you these slides later on, or they'll be up on my website before long. And thanks to the following people for their help, and it's also, of course, the Open Icon Library, who I stole a lot of my icons from. A quick plug: DerbyCon's happening September 27th through September 27th through 30th this year, down in Louisville, Kentucky. Make it if you can, and a whole bunch of other conferences that I usually go to and try to support. Finally, are there any questions? Because I know I'm running short on time. I figure you were standing there like. Any questions? All right, sorry if that was like drinking from the fire hose, and I thank you for your time.
All right, next presentation, if you haven't figured it out, is on the hour.